Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful that they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these special places by creating trails and planting trees. These preserves are then open for you and I to use to hike, hunt, fish, and birdwatch 365 days a year. Places like Shanks Ferry, Pelham Hills, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us all better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture is a 40-minute presentation followed by 20 minutes of question and answer. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. We'll do our best to have them answered by the end of the presentation. This is the second lecture of our 2022 fall-winter season. Our next Nature Hour will be October 26th, welcoming all faces in outdoor places, a panel discussion about diversity in the outdoors with Felipe Benitez, Executive Director of the Corazon Latino Organization, and Dr. Zishan Ismat, Director of the Blackbirds Organization. You can learn more and pre-register for this lecture and many other events coming up on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors who include Clark Associates, Staffers of Kissel Hill, Lakshwama, Electron Energy Corporation, Eurofins, DART, Ratu Associates, and Penn Stone. The work of the Conservancy would not be possible without the generous support of these sponsors. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, the history and health of Pennsylvania's woods, with our very own forester, Eric Roper. I could read Eric's bio, and it's impressive. He's worked as a forester for the state of Virginia. He ran his own forestry consulting business. And in his role at the Conservancy, we're very, very fortunate to have Eric. In his role at the Conservancy, he is entirely responsible for all the vegetation management on all 50 preserves, totaling over 8,000 acres. We protected 10,000. We just transferred a huge tract of land to the state into one of the newest state parks, which we are thrilled about. So we manage about, between about 8,500 acres, and Eric is responsible for all the vegetation management on all those acreages. And so, with land protection, it starts with our land protection team buying and protecting land forever. But then that's not the end of the story. That's really the beginning in a lot of ways. Our stewardship team then has to step in and work to manage that land and in a lot of cases heal that land in the right way. And that often starts with Eric's incredible expertise and knowledge of vegetative communities in the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm extremely excited to hear this presentation tonight. Eric, I know that you're in the middle of an extremely busy planting season right now. Fall is a time to put trees in the ground, and I know you've got huge plans because we've been coordinating volunteer events around that and dodging weather. So I really appreciate you taking the time to put this presentation together and for being with us tonight. Eric, can you unmute?
Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank you for joining us. Let me get my camera turned on here and my screen. Tonight we will be discussing the history and health of Pennsylvania woods. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Keith. It is my honor to be here speaking with you guys tonight. We're going to cover a wide range of topics. We will start by looking at historical uses of Pennsylvania's forests from the pre-colonial times through the 15th to the 20th centuries, into the 21st century, and where do we go from here? And as Keith said, at the end, we will have time for questions. So if anything comes up during the course of the presentation, feel free to pop a question into the question and answer box, and we will get to it at the end. So as I said, we will start with historical uses of Pennsylvania's forest pre-European settlement. There were a number of ways that the Native Americans managed Pennsylvania's forests for a number of different uses. One of the most significant tools that they used was prescribed fire. And there was a wide variety of uses for prescribed fire. To improve hunting grounds. It's really hard to hunt if you can't see what you're shooting at. So prescribed fire was used to keep the oak, chestnut, and hickory forest open, so they had open shooting lanes. For the purpose of communication, while it's not as widely used as some of the other methods, it was an important use. Livestock forage production. Historically, much of southeastern Pennsylvania was covered in oak savannas. In order to regenerate those grasslands, prescribed fire was an important tool to keep not just the forage available, but to keep the forage nutrition availability high. When you burn a grassland, you recycle those nutrients. Those nutrients grow back into the grasses. And so you have increased the value of each bite that the livestock takes. For human forage production, some of you may have visited our Clark Nature Preserve and seen the beautiful warm season grass meadow that we have out there. You'll have also noticed, if you're like me, fantastic berry production. Again, when you reset those grasslands and those berry producing plants, you get more abundant and more consistent crops. And finally, for defense purposes, it is far easier to see the enemy that you are defending your land against when you have open spaces in front of you, and again, open channels throughout the forest land. But the role of prescribed fire also played an important part in the structure and the composition of the forest. As you're walking through the forest today, you may notice that different tree species have different levels of bark thickness. Your oak, previously chestnut, and your eastern white pine are all thick barked species. This made them particularly resilient to fire. So when a low intensity fire would come through, they were not susceptible to mortality. You may also notice some of the other species, such as maple, beech, and birch, had thinner bark. The thinner bark allowed the fire to kill those trees and to maintain the desirable structure. Because again, if you're looking for hunting production, for livestock production, you're going to want oak acorns, and you're going to increase your mass production when you have a larger oak component in the forest. Repeated use of the fire would also keep understories open to allow for those longer sight lines when hunting that we discussed earlier. As Europeans colonized Pennsylvania and the Northeast in general, the uses of the forest changed. You began to see the clearing of forest lands for agriculture. As our populations exploded, you needed to produce more food. Suitable soils are sometimes found in woods. They're also sometimes productive ag lands. Those areas were cleared in order to increase the food production. Timber production. Again, as populations increase, building materials are needed. So timber production became a large industry in Pennsylvania between the 15th and 20th century. Charcoal production. Charcoal was a key component of not only cooking food and heating houses, but also powering things like locomotives. And chestnut blight. As we discussed earlier, chestnut used to be a significant component of the woods of Pennsylvania. And we will get into that a little as we move forward. Converting forest for farmlands. So population increased, again, as we said, the need for agricultural food production and for building materials increased. One way to meet that demand was to clear productive soils of trees and convert them previously forested lands into homesteads and productive ag lands. The shift in forest cover coincided with what is not directly related to a change in species composition. And I realize that there's a lot going on in this slide, but if you focus in, you can see a couple of the species that I mentioned earlier, like oak. Pre-colonial times, you had about 489 towns. Modern times, in the same space, you had about 467 towns. But if you look at the stems of oak, you went from 49,000 stems in the study area to 11,662. Other species, again, that we spoke about earlier, species like birch and beech and maple. As oak was harvested for timber production or cleared off lands, and as the uses of the woods changed from frequent burnings, sometimes as frequently as every 8 to 10 years, you saw the species composition change. And really that species composition change is very evident in today's woodlands, and we will get to that later in the presentation. But I would encourage you to take some time as I'm speaking and focus on this slide and go back later and really take note of some of the drastic changes in species composition throughout our forest, particularly looking at things, like I said, like the maples, the chestnut, the hickory, and the oak, because it's very telling in changes of forest use. Timber and charcoal production. According to the state, by 1895, Pennsylvania contained 9 million acres of forest land. That's a lot of forest, but that's less than a third of the total forested acreage before European colonization. And I'd like to put a caveat in here to say that timber production is an important aspect of active and responsible forest management. However, unfortunately, that is not what always occurred in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and into the 20th centuries. And that is not to say that all sawmills and all foresters were exploitative, but there was a resource available, there was a need for it, and some folks, against perhaps their better judgment or science's guidance, went ahead and they cleared those lands. And you can kind of see here what that looked like in the early 20th century. Let's talk about some of the forest products from the 15th to the 20th century. Eastern white pine. You know, back when Pennsylvania was colonized, most of the traveling was still done by ships. If you have been out in the woodlands and you've noticed a large eastern white pine, you may notice that the figure that it cuts is extremely conducive to a ship mast. Eastern white pine was cut in mass to produce ship mast. And again, it was an important aspect of building America and building the Northeast, but it did have its impact on the forest. Eastern hemlock. The bark was extremely important to the leather industry. Tannin is a chemical that is found in the bark of eastern hemlock, and it is crucial for tanning leather. Chestnut, as we discussed, it's no longer the dominant, as we will discuss, it is no longer a dominant component of the forests of Pennsylvania, but the rot resistance of the wood made it extremely, extremely important to the rural economy, as it was perfect for things such as fencing, roofing, flooring, and finally, as we spoke about, a wide variety of hardwood trees were perfect for charcoal production, railroad ties, and constructing the roofs of mines, among many other uses. And for that reason, they were cut, and they were cut very heavily. We'll talk a little bit here about chestnut blight. Chestnut blight was first introduced into the New Jersey and New York area in the end of the 1890s, early 20th century, early 1900s. In 1904, it spread to Pennsylvania. Within 50 years, it had wiped out almost every mature American chestnut in Pennsylvania. Chestnut blight is a fungus native to East and Southeast Asia. And in North America, there was simply no resistance in the American chestnut tree to this blight. American chestnut was an extremely important component of the forests of Pennsylvania. It was often a dominant canopy tree, and it helped maintain not just vertical, but also horizontal structure and diversity. When you have scattered large trees and you have an acre of land with a set carrying capacity, that acre of land can only produce enough nutrients, enough light, enough water to maintain so many trees. And chestnut occupied a large cross section of that area. When chestnut was lost, you had a very important component of forest structure that went along with it. As we spoke about earlier, American chestnut was an extremely, extremely valuable forest product, but it wasn't just the rot-resistant wood. Often farmers and livestock producers would fatten up their hogs and cows before they went to market, feeding them on chestnuts. The nut from the chestnut fed billions of insects, birds, and mammals. And as the songs will tell you, chestnuts were a prized holiday treat in homes across the country. And in the fall, it was not uncommon to see railroad cars overflowing with chestnuts being delivered to cities like New York, Washington, and Chicago. Now that we've discussed a little bit of the historical uses of Pennsylvania's forest, let's talk about where we are today. We talked about the importance of the American chestnut in maintaining horizontal and vertical stand diversity. With the loss of the American chestnut, the decrease in the oak and hickory component, and the increase in maple, beech, and birch, what we are left with is a early to mid succession forest that is prevalent across Pennsylvania, but particularly here in southeastern Pennsylvania. And in that successional stage, what you have is a stem count stocking that is up and a basal area that remains flat. Basal area is a forestry term that refers to the cross-sectional area of a tree at 4.5 feet. So if you were to take a tree, cut it off at 4.5 feet, your basal area would be the area occupied by that tree stem. So it's a way of describing volume. Understory recruitment. As you know, trees naturally regenerate themselves. When we do not have sufficient understory recruitment, we have problems continuing to regenerate our forest naturally. Invasive species, pests, and pathogens. Right now in southeastern Pennsylvania and across the mid-Atlantic, everybody's familiar with spotted lanternfly, but there are any number that we will discuss here tonight. And finally, our final topic to discuss tonight in the state of Pennsylvania forests in the 21st century, the continued habitat loss and fragmentation. I introduced you to two forestry terms, stocking and basal area. Today now we'll discuss how they're correlated. When you have an increase of stems, your increase in stocking, as we discussed earlier, every acre of land has a carrying capacity. When you increase the stocking, you're increasing the demand on light, water, nutrients from the soil. So you have a shift in how your basal area is distributed across your diameter classes. Because your stocking is increased, your basal area distribution across your diameter classes will shift from basal area heavily weighted across a couple trees in large diameter classes to a higher number of trees with smaller diameters. Again, there are simply limits on what a piece of land can provide for, and that is why you see that correlation between stocking and basal area. Historically, Pennsylvania's forests, when they were dominated by oak and hickory more recently, and oak and chestnut previously, were heavily weighted in larger diameter classes with lower stocking levels. This resulted in a more open forest. For those of you who have been out west, you may be familiar with the Ponderosa pine forest. While they may not have looked entirely like that, they were certainly more diverse than what we see across much of the Pennsylvania landscape today, and particularly in southeastern Pennsylvania. Understory recruitment and deer pressure. The Conservancy started over 50 years ago by a group of hunters and fishermen. Unfortunately, hunting as a hobby has decreased in popularity across Pennsylvania. As the popularity of hunting has decreased, deer populations have increased. Deer, like any cow, human, goat, need to eat something. And oak seedlings, maple seedlings, hickory seedlings, those are extremely palatable. So as the deer is walking through the forest, there's any number of oak seedlings that are recently started that they can nip upon. And when they nip that terminal bud, that seedling no longer has a chance to ascend from the sapling stage, from the seedling stage into the sapling stage, and eventually into the dominant crown class. And as such, the increased deer pressure has created issues maintaining adequate natural regeneration across southeastern Pennsylvania. There are other factors at play here, and we'll get into them somewhat, but it is not a stretch to say that the decrease in hunting is having adverse effects on the health of Pennsylvania's forests. Invasive pests, plants, pests, and pathogens. We discussed earlier carrying capacity. Any acre of land only can provide for so many plant species. In 2020, we have an increase in our invasive plant communities. When you have a population of mile-a-minute, honeysuckle, whether it's bush or Japanese, or multifloral rose, that requires space. It also requires light. It also requires water. It also requires nutrients. So anywhere where you have these invasive plant communities growing, they will preclude the establishment of native tree seedlings. For those of you who have taken a walk at Otter Creek or out at McCall's Ferry, you may have noticed the large hemlock trees that are prominent along the riparian buffer. You may have also noticed as you're looking up through those hemlock trees, little white tufts on the underside of the needles. That is the hemlock woolly agelid. It is an invasive insect affecting our eastern hemlock. Signs, missing a species or missing a slide there, I apologize. Signs of hemlock woolly agelid infestation include the white mass on the underside of needles and the thinning of the crowns. Current estimates are not accurate for predicted mortality of hemlock woolly agelid, of eastern hemlocks as a result of the agelid, but the range is from 0 to 99%. But anybody who has taken a walk through Otter Creek and noticed the thinning crowns understand what a problem this is. Trees, like humans, only have so much energy. When that energy is spent fending off an invasive pest, pathogen, or plant, they have that much less energy for seed production. When they do not have energy for seed production, there is a problem with regenerating underneath themselves. And that is why you may have noticed a decline in the overall hemlock populations along some of our riparian buffers. Currently, there is a debate on the best methods to combat the agelid. Some of those include introducing additional invasive species that feed on the agelid. Some of those include the use of insecticides. Currently, the Conservancy is weighing our options, but to date, we have not made a decision on which direction we want to go, because while each options have the added benefit of assisting our hemlocks, they also carry unwanted consequences. Habitat loss and fragmentation. The loss of forested lands to development continues to be an issue across Pennsylvania. I'm relatively new to Pennsylvania. I moved to Lancaster County in 2019 to join the Conservancy, but even I can see the continued urban sprawl having its effect. Everybody needs a place to live, but so do our deer, so do our turkey, and we also need places to recreate. And so while we cannot completely stop development, finding targeted areas for preservation that we identify as important is extremely crucial to maintaining the health and the continuity of Pennsylvania's forests. According to one organization, Global Forest Watch, Lancaster County lost 3,014 acres of forested land from 2001 to 2021. You may say, you know, Lancaster County is hundreds of thousands of acres, and that's true, but that's still a pretty significant number. As Keith said, we protect and steward 8,000 acres. The forest loss in Lancaster County is 3,014. That's almost 50% of the Lancaster Conservancy's in-fee holdings. It's not an insignificant number. So you may have a question of where do we go from here? Our stewardship staff wrestles with these questions every day because there is no easy answer to these problems. And there are so many issues to address and so many different ways to address them that we have to be smart in how we go about it. One of those ways that we're going about that is through ag field conversion. As part of the Conservancy's holdings, whether it was through PPL deals or through other land deals, we became owners of lands that have been productive in agriculture, whether that be cool season grasses for hay production, cornfields, or soybeans. As we spoke about earlier, the oak savanna, which is an oak meadow, used to be prominent across the southeastern Pennsylvania landscape. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find one. In 2020, we identified 2 sites that were prime for ag field conversion. One of them at Kelly's Run Nature Preserve and the other at Safe Harbor Nature Preserve. We were able to secure some funding through our conservation partners at the Natural Resource Conservation Service in consultation with Pheasants Forever to begin that ag field conversion. It is not an easy process. It involves exterminating the resistant seed bank that is built out over the years, the planting of trees, which is not cheap, and the elimination of the invasive species that would threaten those converted ag sites. In 2021, we planted the first trees at Safe Harbor Nature Preserve. As part of that project, we will plant 7 acres into a 26-acre former hayfield into trees. That tree planting will be completed this week. The other 19 acres will be drill seeded into a warm season grass pollinator meadow, with the eventual outcome being a large expanse of 26 acres that had formerly been cut 3, 4, maybe even 5 times a summer into a self-perpetuating warm season grass pollinator meadow that blooms throughout the year. Not only will it provide beautiful sight lines to visitors at our Safe Harbor Nature Preserve and wildlife habitat for turkey and deer, as well as non-game species like songbirds and pollinators, but it will also sequester an estimated 39 tons of carbon per year. That is not a small number. At Kelly's Run, we're using a similar prescription. For those who have visited Kelly's Run, you may have been greeted by a small pollinator park when you pull up. It was planted by volunteers and Conservancy staff. We plan to expand that from a small pollinator meadow concentrated around the parking lot to all 3 fields that greet you when you join Kelly's Run. As with Safe Harbor, we will also be planting trees there. Again, these trees, these grasses will be self-perpetuating, and they will also provide wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat, as well as important ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration. I'm happy to also tell you that a 3rd project was recently approved at Tuckwin Glen Nature Preserve with a similar prescription. Invasive species control measures. This is how I spend about 2/3 of my summer. It is a labor of love, but it is also a labor of blood and sweat. It involves getting out there with manual removal tools, as well as with the assistance of chemicals at times. To date, we are currently focusing on target areas that were treated in 2019, 2020, and 2021. But as we are building out, we are seeing gains, and we are now able to expand those measures. Our top targets vary from site to site, but personally, Japanese knotweed, golden bamboo, honeysuckle, and multiflora rose are the top, in my own minute, are the top targets that we pursue. And this work is done in coordination with our regional preserve managers, our land stewards, and in accordance with long-held, scientifically approved practices and on-label pesticide and herbicide usage. Riparian buffer plantings. As you know, there is a large effort underway to clean up the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And while while we do not own any lands that immediately abut the Chesapeake Bay, we do own 8,000 acres and steward 8,000 acres in local watersheds that eventually empty into the Chesapeake Bay. It's because of that that we partner with organizations like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation in their project to plant 10,000 trees or 10 million trees across Pennsylvania. We have focused our riparian buffer plantings in areas such as Fishing Creek Nature Preserve. For those of you who have been down there, you may remember the beautiful ford crossings, the running stream, the beautiful hemlock, eastern white pine, oak forest, but you may not have noticed that there is a lack of regeneration in a bunch of those sites. We began to address this problem in 2020 with some of our armament plantings, and we have continued that project in 2021 and the maintaining of those species in of those plantings in 2022, excuse me. And finally, you're all familiar with our land protection efforts. It is one thing to steward lands, it is one thing to steward our forests, but without the efforts of our land protection team, we would not have lands to steward, we would not have lands to protect. And as we discussed, habitat loss and fragmentation is still remains today one of the greatest threats to the health of Pennsylvania's forests. And so it is in continuing those efforts that we continue to help address the health and the state of Pennsylvania's forests across Lancaster County and help fight back against the habitat loss and the forest loss that was illustrated in the slide between 2000 and 2021. Thank you for taking some time tonight. And fortunately, it looks like we finished up about 6 minutes early, so we should have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, wow, that was excellent, Eric. Thank you so much, and thanks for your work. I mean, sincerely, I've been part of the Conservancy for about 2 years, and me personally, when I look at all the environmental threats that the planet faces, it gets to be pretty overwhelming. But when I get out in the field with you and do invasive removals or tree planting, and we're making a difference regionally, and we can see that impact, and that's the solution, right? And so there's a lot of hope there. And I was reminded of the Safe Harbor planting last year when one of our volunteers, Gary, made the statement, I'm probably not gonna see these trees. And there's a Greek proverb that says, a society grows great when people plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. And there's just a lot of hope in that. And so, thanks for coordinating all that. That's all your knowledge and your prescription and everything that we follow. And so thank you for that. And I wanted to also give a shout out to some of our volunteer land stewards who are in the audience. They're also key participants in this. So you know who you are. And thanks for your efforts on the tree planting and on the invasive removals. And you described it perfectly, Eric, sweat and blood. We got a couple of really great questions. And so one is, the American chestnut. And when you were looking at those numbers, that data that you presented about the difference in stem count, the chestnut went from 7,000 to 11 in that time frame because of the blight. Is there anything we can do to reintroduce? And can you talk about the efforts to reintroduce blight-resistant American chestnuts?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, these efforts are being led by the American Chestnut Foundation. Locally, the efforts are being led by Tim Eck, who is a Washington Borough native and a supporter of the Conservancy. For those who have been to Clark Nature Preserve, you may have noticed some areas off to the side of those meadows that are behind fences. It is in those areas that the American Chestnut Foundation is doing some of their scientific research. And what that involves doing is hybridizing the American chestnut with the Chinese chestnut, which has a resistance to the blight. Now, as we sort of touched on earlier, when it comes to how we're going to address hemlock, you always have to be careful when you introduce the genetics of a non-native plant to an area. And so it is not a process or a procedure or a study that they are taking lightly or moving fast on. If I am not mistaken, they are at about 13/16, and by that I mean 13/16 of the genetics of the trees that they are currently seeing chestnut blight resistance in 13/16 of that would be American chestnut. 3/16 of those genetics would be Chinese chestnut. The goal is to get that to 15/16 or 16/16 and fully introduce chestnut blight resistance into the American chestnut. It's important to note that the American chestnut is not extinct. You may have American chestnut in your yard. You may see American chestnut at a preserve such as Fox Hollow. But what you are not going to see is you're not going to see an American chestnut that's probably over 10 inches. Because it's when they're young that blight comes around and they develop serious cankers on the bark. And that canker on the bark is what kills the tree. I'm sorry, the blight is what kills the tree. The blight causes the canker, which weakens the tree and leads to its demise.
Yeah, I thought I just saw an article where Natural Lands, our sister organization in Chester County, had a really large chestnut discovered on one of their preserves just recently,
And I should
very encouraging.
I should also say that and I had this discussion with somebody earlier. There are legacy American chestnuts out there. I know of a couple in Virginia, but when you have those American chestnuts out there, what you have is you have a wolf tree or wolf population, meaning it is out there on its own. Because it was not present or around other chestnuts, it was never infected with the blight. What you do not have is you do not have the dominance across the Pennsylvania landscape that the chestnut used to maintain. And until we reach chestnut blight resistance, we will not see large scale, widespread, massive chestnuts the way they used to dominate Pennsylvania's forest. But there is hope out there still.
Yeah, there's a lot of hope. I mean, we worked with the American Chestnut Society last year in collecting some of the chestnuts coming off those more resistant trees for replanting, and there's a lot of great progress being made there. It's definitely encouraging. So, speaking of the introduction of diseases, another one was introduced with Dutch elm disease. And can you comment on how significant, how abundant elm trees were prior to the introduction of Dutch elm disease?
This part of Pennsylvania, I am not aware of the elm being a prominent component of the historical forest of Pennsylvania. I think if we go back to that slide, we will get some numbers. Now, when you go out to the western part of the state, the elm is far more common on the western part of the state and into the Midwest. So there you see the impact of Dutch elm disease a lot more widespread. You have entire towns where, all their boulevard trees that they planted, 100 years ago were all elm because there was no Dutch elm disease, and all those trees are dying now. To my knowledge, and you will have to forgive me because even though I work in Pennsylvania today, I went to school in Montana, but I do not believe that elm was ever a prime component of the forest of southeastern Pennsylvania. So we did not see a dramatic shift from Dutch elm disease. Although if you live in Lancaster City, you may have a Dutch elm disease or an elm in your front yard that did succumb to Dutch elm disease.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to note that all these diseases were introduced post-European settlement. And I thought you brought up a great point about pre-European settlement and how these forests were managed systems long before Europeans arrived. And I was wondering if maybe you could comment a little bit more about how Native peoples used prescribed fire, especially in terms of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the old trope about smoke signals, but it is an old trope because it was a method of communicating. But it would not just be the smoke signals. You could burn a piece of land in order to communicate to a friendly neighboring tribe that there is productive forest land here. There is productive forage land here. You can bring your cattle here. They will find food, or they need to stay away because perhaps there is not a friendly tribe in the area, and they come across an area that is not traditionally burned, and it was burned for a reason, as perhaps they had to flee for another area because an unfriendly tribe happened to have made their presence felt.
Yeah, and I definitely want to acknowledge that much of the land that we stored today are the ancestral lands of the Susquehannocks, the Conestogas, Shanks Ferry peoples. And it's always my hope that we as a conservancy, and I believe we are doing this, are as good a steward as those native peoples were prior to us. And that we continue that legacy that they've left for us. And part of that is making some hard decisions, right? So you mentioned 2 invasive species that we as a conservancy, I know, Eric, because you and I have had these conversations that we've been grappling with. What do we do about spotted lanternfly? And what do we do about, Hemlock woolly adelgid? Do we spray? Do we not spray? And I'm wondering if concerning the adelgid, if you can comment on, some of the methods that you mentioned that are potential controls that we are weighing the risk of using. If you could talk about some of the drawbacks to some of those potential controls that are being considered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting that you mentioned spotted lanternfly. When I joined the Conservancy in 2019, spotted lanternfly was still pretty new to southeastern Pennsylvania. Word was going out that we were going to see billions of dollars in economic loss from spotted lanternfly, primarily in the forest products industry. And my first year, we took it seriously as it should be taken seriously. But I think as most folks have seen it play out, while it is a pest and a nuisance, it is not necessarily as destructive to desirable tree species. And by desirable, I'm talking about our native tree species, as we once feared. Now, we were right to receive those warnings because people should not have taken it flippantly and should not take it flippantly. But the realized effects were not as drastic as forecasted. And with HWA, what we are seeing is while there is no concrete number on mortality rates, we are seeing significant impacts to our forests. And a measured response is required. But the question becomes, what is a measured response? Is a measured response using powerful insecticides like neonicotinoids that will help us control HWA, but also have drastic impacts on our American honeybee population, on our bird population, on our pollinator populations? Is that the answer? I don't know. And that's one of the cost benefits we're still weighing. It's also how realistic is it to deploy that on a landscape level? It's one thing if you have a couple of hemlocks in your backyard, but when you steward 8,000 acres, can you, in good conscience, deploy a control measure that has known serious impacts, not just realistically, but also economically, and again, with good conscience? So far, we've come down, and that's not really how we would like to handle the situation, because the potential harm outweighs the potential benefit to the hemlock tree. And one of the other control methods that's really being discussed heavily is the introduction of predators from Asia. Now, across the course of history, species have been introduced to control invasive species that were often introduced. There's been times it's worked well. There's been times it's backfired. There are more studies being done today by USDA, APHIS in particular, to realize the potential damaging impacts of such a control measure. But I don't know that the science is necessarily there that we can, in good conscience, release a non-native species to combat a non-native species if we don't know what the potential detrimental effects 20 years down the road. When the predator wipes out the agelid, what does it feed on next?
Yeah, it's like the lady that swallowed the fly. Really extreme caution needs to be used going that route, I think. You mentioned logging and forestry as a management tool, and I certainly, as long as it's done sustainably, I've seen that done effectively. And in fact, at the last We Conserve PA conference, it was a really great presentation about the significant decline in our bird abundances in the state of Pennsylvania over the last century, essentially, but really accelerated in the last 60 years. And And the presenter gave a really strong case that that's related to stand monoculture. Basically, it's an even age stand across the state of Pennsylvania, and the solution to that is logging, is intentionally doing some clear cuts to get, you know, to diversify the age of the stand, so that we've got, you know, bird species that depend on that early successional shrub habitat, that they've got a place to live in addition to the species that need some older growth stuff. The concern with that here, where we work, is when we clear cut a piece of land, you know, what kind of recruitment are we going to get back? You mentioned a recruitment problem a couple of times, and can those young trees compete with the non-native invasives? And so I'm wondering, you know, we had a question here about some land that's being logged near where John works, and he's worried about, you know, the deer pressure on the regeneration, and also on you know, the invasives coming in that would hinder the regeneration. So can you comment on that as a real viable tool, given those other stresses within our ecosystem here?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's important to keep in mind when discussing logging, because it is a sensitive subject in Pennsylvania, because, you know, as we discussed, there is a serious history of exploitative forestry that has occurred in Pennsylvania. And so people should be concerned about how a timber sale is being conducted. But it is a crucial part of maintaining a healthy forest. You know, before we get to the question, I will just say, you know, the Conservancy had an extremely successful and beneficial ash salvage harvest on our Donegal Highlands Nature Preserve in 2019. What we were seeing was, you know, as many folks were seeing, we were seeing our ash trees dying, and we saw a window where those trees could be salvaged. All that economic and ecological value was going to be lost, and safety hazards were going to be created. So we went in and very consciously removed just the impacted ash, and just in areas where we could do so, where we were not worried about long-term harm to the overall health of the preserve. Now, when it comes to a responsible timber harvest, it's important to remember that there are also different prescriptions that can be assigned. Clear cut is not a copy and paste prescription across a wide array of landscapes. Now, if you're in the Southeast where loblolly pine is grown in plantations, yeah, you're going to see a lot of clear cuts. If you're out west where lodgepole pine needs a stand replacing event to regenerate itself, a clear cut is absolutely going to be the appropriate prescription. But when you start talking about wanting to diversify age classes and diversify stand structure, you're talking about a selective harvest. And I don't know what kind of harvest is being done near where John works. And I couldn't comment on that harvest specifically without knowing a little bit of what the woods looked like before, and what the stocking and basal area, the two metrics that we discussed earlier, what those looked like. But I can tell you that foresters generally have a ethos that, whether it is as a result of an environmental conscious decision or a monetary decision for the consultant or for the landowner for whom they are consulting, they would like to see that forest regenerate itself. If all the trees are cut and the forests don't regenerate themselves, a forester has worked themselves out of a job. So pre-sale work, such as invasive species control, is an important tool that most foresters employ before they go out and perform a responsible timber sale. And I can't comment on whether it was done at this particular sale, but I can tell you that it's not uncommon across Pennsylvania for invasive species to be controlled, not just ahead of a sale, but also post-sale. So that those trees that regenerate themselves, say the prescription was for a seed tree harvest, which is a cut that leaves a prescribed amount of stocking across a range of basal area. The idea behind that cut is to encourage the residual trees to produce seed to regenerate the stand following the disturbance. If you do not perform pre-sale and post-sale measures, any of the benefits from that prescription are lost, because, you know, the multiflora rose, the bamboo, the knotweed, it's all going to grow quicker than the seedlings are. And if you're looking to diversify species composition, again, you need to be doing some pre-sale work and some post-sale work. Otherwise, you may end up with another monoculture. And again, a consulting forester wants to have a job, and they're not going to have a job if what comes back is a shrubby thicket mess. And so they have an incentive to perform those measures. When it comes to deer pressure, especially post-sale, we talked about the carrying capacity of land, but just like a human, a deer knows when it's had enough. If you go to an all-you-can-eat sushi buffet and you fill your plate up twice and you're feeling full, you may go grab one more piece of sushi, but you're not going to eat until they're out of sushi. It's going to be the same thing with the deer. They're going to see that as a buffet, and they're going to know that they can eat what they please, but they're not going to be able to eat all those sprouts coming up, because they also want diversity across their diet. You don't want just sushi from morning to night. You may want a salad in there. And so the deer may want to munch on some poplar, but he also probably wants to go get some blackberries from the berry bush, or perhaps go munch on some grasses. So again, I can't comment on that specific sale, but I can tell you that there are measures both in the forester's control and in the wildlife's hands that should help lead to a healthy regeneration of that forest.
Cool. So, speaking of healthy regeneration, it seems to me that a lot of this would start in the soil. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about soil health and how that relates to pest vulnerability, but also, and I'm not aware of this, it's a great question from Barbara about remineralizing our soils the way Germany did that in the Black Forest. And I'm not aware of that effort of remineralizing soil in the Black Forest, but I wonder if you can comment on either one of those.
I am not particularly familiar with the remineralizing of the Black Forest. But nutrient loss, which would be minerals, is a serious concern when it comes to soil health. And one of the measures we're taking at the Conservancy to ensure soil health is to ensure soil stability. Soil stability is going to be your first protection against soil health. It doesn't matter how healthy your soil is if it's all washing into the creek every time it rains. That's why we really like to highlight the importance of getting out there and planting trees, especially in highly erodible soils, like we're doing at Safe Harbor, like we did 10, 15 years ago at the Reed Run Meadow at Clark Nature Preserve. Maintaining soil stability is going to be your first step there. And when you do go out and you plant those trees, you also have nutrient cycling. It's not just the trees taking from the soil. There's the returning of nutrients to the soil from the trees themselves. I really wish I knew a little bit more about the remineralizing of the soil in the Black Forest, but I can also tell you that, as we discussed, the logistics of landscape level insecticide applications to protect hemlocks, landscape level nutrient management across our entire portfolio is not only probably irresponsible because we would be doing it places that wouldn't be needed, but it's not fiscally or physically possible with our staff at this time. Now, that is not to say that down the line, we will not identify areas where we think a nutrient management plan is not only appropriate, but needed. But that process will be developed as we really start to flesh out our forest management plans, which is something we started doing in 2019. I wish we were a little further along in that process, but as I said earlier, protecting all these lands is really crucial right now. And if that means that we move a little bit slower when it comes to developing our forest management plans, I'm okay with that as long as we keep moving forward in that regard.
Yeah, once it's a warehouse, there's no vegetation left to manage anyway. You can't recover from that, I'm wondering, just the act of planting and restoration, I think will have a lot of positive benefit for soil health. I mean, I'm thinking about the root zone depths of some of those meadow species that we typically put in that mix, and how, they're reaching 6, 10 feet deep compared to the typical, farm crops that are only going, less than a foot. And all that carbon sequestration, and also N and P cycling that's going on in the soil there. So, really great question. I need to look that up about how they remineralize soils in the Black Forest, and I want to learn about that. Speaking of tree species, and I know you're planning a planting for tomorrow and then again on Monday. What kind of species is typically in your suite?
You know, it really depends on the site and what the goal is. When it comes to our equip plantings, that we were given this funding to target pollinator habitat. And so when we're looking to plant trees for pollinator habitat, we are looking at pollinator friendly trees. So while we are looking for pollinator friendly trees, we're also looking for site appropriate trees. So when you're out walking in the woods, you know, spin your head around and see, you know, what am I seeing? Am I seeing locust? Am I seeing poplar? Am I seeing oak? Am I seeing all of them? What am I seeing is the most dominant? When we're talking about a savanna, and especially starting one from scratch, a meadow, we probably don't want to be going in there and planting mid or late successional species. We want to be planting species that would mimic a late succession meadow and early succession forest. So we look towards a locust, but we also want to consider things like, you know, if we are establishing a pollinator meadow, those pollinators need sunlight in order to bloom to be beneficial to those pollinators. So we don't want to shade out the entire meadow. So we look to a lot of viburnums, which don't just flower beautifully, but they flower for a long time. We plant a lot of redbud. We plant a lot of dogwood. 9-bark is a personal favorite of mine, because this is going to sound silly, but when you're planting a lot of trees, not every tree maybe is always planted perfectly. And if you have a shrub like 9-bark that's extremely resilient, you may be able to get away with, oh shoot, you know, I didn't quite plant that thing perfectly, and it's gonna stay and thrive regardless, as long as it can take hold. But also, you know, I spoke to our conservation partner, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Tree planting is not cheap. When you're out there looking at a field of planted trees that are staked and tubed, you got to look at not just the effort that went into there, but there's a significant monetary cost that right now is covered by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. In 2021, and I'm sure the price is higher this year, every single tube you were seeing out there is $5.75. That's kind of an insane price right there, especially when you start talking about planting 3,000 trees. Those stakes are $3 a piece. The seedling itself is the cheapest part of the whole thing.
Right.
But if you're looking at just a capital expense of $10 per tree, and that's before labor, and you have a conservation partner like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that has funding to plant 10 million trees, I tend to look at what species they've made available first, which species fit our area, and which species fit our project. Now, that's not to say we don't buy seedlings if they're not available through Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and we log those seedlings that we purchase on our own into the CBF as well. But when you have a partner that's willing to cost share $10 per tree, I really tend to appreciate that gesture and to consult their list and consult their inventory before I make purchases outside of that.
Yeah, that's a great partner and a great point. And we are definitely grateful for that the work that CBF's doing and the partnership that they've established with us through that program. And, you know, last year we were out on Safe Harbor. How many trees did we put in one day? Something ridiculous.
In 2 days, we got over 1,000 trees in.
Yeah, I mean, that was just just seeing that old hayfield get converted instantly with, you know, almost a all hands on deck effort from our staff, plus a whole army of volunteers out there assisting. It was just an awesome event. So, you know, Eric, thanks for your time. And again, I know you're in the middle of a crazy busy planting season, and you took time to put this together and be with us tonight. Really appreciate it. Everybody, thank you all for tuning in. If you're a volunteer land steward, thanks for assisting Eric in his work. We could not do it without you, with 8,500 acres to steward, 10,000 protected, 8,500 to steward. It's a huge effort for the 6 folks on our stewardship team. So thank you, VLS, Volunteer Land Stewards, for assisting. Our next Nature Hour is going to be October 26th, Welcoming All Faces in Outdoor Places, a panel discussion on diversity in the outdoors and access in the outdoors with Felipe Benitez, the executive director of the Cars of Latino organization, and Dr. Zishan Ismat, director of Blackbirds. We have a whole bunch of other events coming up through the rest of the fall and into early winter. You can find information about all those at lancasterconservancy.org under upcoming events. Thank you for your time, everybody. Good night.